As we have seen, the Japanese Prime Minister's first day here in Seoul mainly focused on the summit with President Yoon Suk Yeol. Let's take a closer look at what the two leaders have come to agree on with Professor Kim Mi-kyoung from Pukyong National University. Welcome back to the program, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good morning. First off, Professor, what did you think of the Yoon-Kishida summit in general? Did you think the summit turned out as you thought it would?
Yeah, I think it was very good. The atmosphere was personable and amicable, and the two leaders seemed to be on very good terms, supportive of each other. And also they all seemed like important bilateral issues were on table as well. So, I like to think that the two leaders are heading off to a very positive and mutually supportive direction. And another thing was that it was great to see our president engaging with South Korean press corps. It has been a while since, the people of South Korea heard him talking about substantive issues in a good while. Of course, in the company of Japanese Prime Minister Kishida and Japanese press corps.
Right. And also many agreements coming out just one day. Yoon and Kishida agreed to jointly visit a monument for Korean victims of the atomic bomb when the South Korean leader visits Hiroshima to attend the G summit later this month. First, Professor Kim, as a person who spent years in that city, how significant is that monument?
The monument is significant in many ways. The monument was completed initially in 1970, and it took about 29 years, about 30 years for the monument to be relocated within the premise of Hiroshima Peace Park. And the monument is dedicated to about 50,000 Korean victims of atomic bombing, which took place on August 6th of 1945. And when we look at the historical context, their deaths were very tragic because they lost, their country to Japanese colonialists, and then most of them were forced laborers in order to support Japan's war making when the bombing took place at the hands of the U.S. So, the monument is to commemorate the souls of the deceased Korean victims who were caught in the middle of multiple tragedies in their lives. So it is historically significant, and it is meaningful that both leaders of South Korea and Japan are going to pay tribute to the monument.
Right. You just briefly touched upon it. The monument itself holds a very deep meaning, history, and also significance. Then what makes their joint visit so notable? I mean, President Yoon Suk Yeol could visit by himself, but Prime Minister Kishida is joining him. So what makes the joint visit so notable then?
Prime Minister Kishida is from Hiroshima. He is a third-generation politician from the region. So, it is serendipitous for Japan to host G7 meeting in his hometown, where he can send out messages to his own constituents locally, and also he can send out message to the international community that Japan still deeply cares about its identity as a peace-loving country in the international community. But by having both leaders paying tribute to the deceased victims of Korean origin, that means both of them acknowledge the significance of historical events that still linger on in both societies where, Koreans in general seem to care deeply about what has happened many years ago, and they still see the salience of continuous historical significance, by watching both leaders trying to remember and pay tribute to the victims. So in a way, it is a good opportunity for President Yoon, who has been drawing criticisms from his opponents, who argue that his sense of historical sensitivity probably is lacking by trying to mend fences with Japan with stronger emphasis on economic benefits and security alliance.
Indeed. And another outcome of the Yoon-Kishida summit talks was that the two leaders agreed to send a group of South Korean experts to Japan to inspect the planned release of radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Professor, how should we interpret this outcome?
We kind of know what the outcome is going to be. That is, the release of treated contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean is going to be okay and safe, and that's already endorsed by IAEA. And having joint investigation of the site, I think has more symbolic meaning than actual and empirical substance. That is, Japan cares about the public sentiment about this release of contaminated but treated water, and Korea happens to be the most adjacent country to Japan, so Japan is trying to make a friendly gesture in order to reassure the Korean public that it is going to be okay. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that the reports and investigations released and done by IAEA and another round of investigation to be conducted by joint investigation team between Korea and Japan are not going to 100% reassure the Korean public of its safety. Why? Because we have historical precedents where the experts repeatedly reminded the public that certain pollutants, such as asbestos, for example, was safe at that time with the scientific knowledge of that time period turned out to be toxic.
Right.
And also tobacco smoking as well.
Right.
That was regarded as something fashionable and fancy, but later on we realized that tobacco smoking can cause cancer, and something like this can happen with Japan's plan to release the contaminated water in the Pacific Ocean, because we cannot know at the moment what kind of health hazard it can cause later on.
Right. And let's see how much information and data will be released from the expert trip later this month. Professor, thank you so much for your insight to this morning.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
You too.